Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-episode series, we're revisiting the interdisciplinary field of comic studies. Our guests are Candida Rifkind and Dominic Davies. Candida is a professor in the Department of English at the University of Winnipeg, and Dom is reader in English at City St. George's, University of London. They've authored the book Graphic Refuge, Visuality and Mobility in Refugee Comics. The title is part of the Crossing Lines series published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which generously supports this series. You may recall the interview we did in April 2024 with Dale Jacobs, who wrote on comics and grief, which is also part of the Crossing Lines series. Graphic Refuge examines how comics, through art and narrative, portray the refugee experience and seek to humanize the representations of the displaced in our current mass media ecosystem. Further, the title explores the dynamics of what it means to be a citizen and/or a refugee. But before we get started, if you want to keep up on the latest programming from the Authority File podcast, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter for information on the current and previous month's episodes. To subscribe, simply visit choice360.org, click on the newsletter sign-up banner in the top right corner, and select the Choice Podcast Updates option. While you're there, you can also sign up for other newsletters published by Choice. In this third episode of our series, we get into the more journalistic characteristics of refugee comics. For example, how they can be a tool for political change and how they're uniquely able to visualize the physical space of refugee camps. Yeah, speaking of the comics journalists and the impact of cartoonists like Joe Sacco, I mean, can you define comics journalism for us a little bit more in depth and offer thoughts on why this form of media and news is perhaps becoming more popular? And Candida, we'll start with you on that.
Sure. I mean, comics journalism is kind of what it says on the tin. It's
Yeah.
journalism done in the form of comics, but there certainly are kind of conventions within it. So I think one of the main ones is the artist draws themselves, and they often draw themselves as imperfect or even in unflattering ways. Joe Sacco famously draws himself wearing glasses with no eyes so that we get a sense visually that he is seeing the world reflected back onto him, that he is a witness. We see cartoonists often drawing themselves as unknowing, as making mistakes, and as being upset or feeling their privilege when they're in these situations. We sometimes even see the process. So some cartoonists will draw themselves doing the drawings. So it's very self-reflexive. And I think that is a major convention of the form as well. In terms of comics journalism, there are different varieties. Some of it might be sponsored and be quite kind of authoritative. One of the books I look at in the section on camps is by Don Brown. It's called The Unwanted, and it's about Syrian refugees making their way to Europe. And it's a more conventional kind of refugee comic than many of the others we look at, because we're really interested in the outliers and the innovators and artists who are pushing the form. But Brown's book uses kind of narration and text boxes to give statistics, to give that kind of journalistic information that we might expect from a usual news article or online piece. And then he also draws people at the human level. He comes down to the ground and he shows everyday life in the camps, which are often quite banal and boring because people in detention camps are just waiting. They're in limbo. There's not much to do. And so in one scene that I look at in the book, he draws the men wearing the soles of their shoes out in one of the camps in North Africa because they're just pacing back and forth all day. But then he also includes statistics about the number of people in that camp. So he's combining, in that kind of new journalistic way, a sense of scene and atmosphere and human interest with the framing information that readers might need. That's one kind of comics journalism at one end of the spectrum. He never actually draws himself in that book, so it seems quite traditional. But then we get to people like Kugler and Glidden who really make themselves part of the story in a more visible and explicit way.
Mm-hmm. I'm really curious, Candid. I want to go back to your initial comments around like Joe Sacco drawing himself without eyes, and the way the journalist or artist kind of imparts this, I guess, fallibility or incompleteness. What's that about? Like, um, what is that? What's going on there? Why are they kind of portraying themselves in this incomplete way?
Well, I'm smiling because I'm picturing Joe Sacco's drawings of himself as kind of a bumbling, inept loser who's kind of around all these people who've been through massive life experiences. And with him, and maybe because of him, it comes out of this tradition of underground comics. Dom was talking earlier about
Mm,
how comics have always been an outsider form. And I see Sacco really as in that kind of underground comics with an X tradition coming out of the counterculture, people like R. Crumb and
yeah.
Art Spiegelman, who draw themselves as sort of the opposite of the superhero comics figure, as kind of schlubs and kind of guys who are just, nerds, and they're not successful with women, and they're always making mistakes. This is the kind of archetype of
Hmm.
alternative comics, the kind of male loser. And I think Joe Sacco continues that a little bit. Certainly in some of his early comics like Palestine, we see him completely confused and befuddled and feeling quite inadequate as a person compared to the strength and resilience of the people he's meeting. So that archetype is coming through from underground comics as well, which certainly were not about things like refugees. They were often
Hmm.
autobiographical,
Right.
about, young guys having problems with women and in life. So I think some of it comes through that, and I think some of it comes from the kind of the seriousness of the situation that a lot of these comics journalists find themselves in, and a sense that they didn't know anything until they got there, and then they're confronted by how much they didn't know. So
Hmm.
that really subverts them as a kind of authority figure. They are there to witness, and they had no idea what they were going to witness, and we see that process. It's really humbling, I think, in a lot of ways, and then inspires them to draw these stories so that other people can realize what they don't know.
Excellent. Thank you. Um, Dom, curious, in kind of putting this book together, and also through your research, how you've seen how refugee comics can be a tool for political change. Have you seen examples of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually want to just sort of run this back round the other question as well about
Sure.
why comics journalism might be booming so much now. Because I think one of the answers is, or one of the reasons, one of the ways in which comics are political is through raising political consciousness, and by finding new readerships in communities that would not normally get access or wouldn't even think to kind of expose themselves to or to read these kind of stories. And I think one of the reasons comics are coming to the fore and there's such a sort of powerful genre or medium at the moment is because they interrupt a visual culture that's profoundly digital now. So on the one hand, we're kind of all learning to read. The way we read now is all a bit in the way that we read comics, in the sense that we're always navigating bits of text and image spliced together. We're kind of intuitively taught now, if you go on a social media feed, to navigate a kind of page of different bits of information and to assemble them into some kind of narrative. So in some sense, comics are kind of ahead of that, in the
Mhm.
sense that they imitate that experience, or they anticipate that experience in many ways. At the same time, thinking of AI art especially, the hand drawn comic is profoundly analog, right? In an era when no one has an analog clock nowadays. Never mind, an analog. All photography is digital photography. Kind of the way we consume our media. Most people read on screens, on Kindles, and so on. So there's actually a kind of something really special, I think, about the fact that we can see the artist's pen on the page. We can feel the movement of their hand. This is something that comics critics talk about a lot, but I think it really um, is really part of the way in which comics kind of feed into or achieve part of their political goals, which are ultimately to recalibrate the relations between citizens and refugees, to find out new forms of solidarity, I guess, between those constituencies, to find out new similarities and also to sort of break down those labels. And that's absolutely something that comics can do.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't really answered your question, but
No, that's okay. I mean,
you said how, not can.
yeah. Well, I mean, certainly they can. I'm wondering if there were any specific, you know, comics that come to mind that actually you could, in hindsight, have had some kind of impact on, uh, creating change.
I'll just give one very quick tangible example. So
Sure.
Positive Negatives, the nonprofit organization that I mentioned earlier, one of their first series of comics that they made was called A Perilous Journey, and it came out in 2015, right at the height of the Syrian refugee crisis, and when the photograph of the Syrian toddler Alan Kurdi kind of went viral, and the interest in refugees in our visual culture was at its height. And those comics were picked up by a number of reports that fed into motions on kind of that were passed in the House of Lords. I'd have to look up the exact details, but the comics were actually used in those kind of reports that were passing through Parliament and forming decision-making processes. And what I think is really special or sort of amazing about those comics is that no refugee was ever harmed in the making of this policy, right? So the comics were a way to mediate the refugee's story without the refugee having to kind of appear in Parliament themselves, have to put themselves on display, render themselves vulnerable in any way. So that's, I think, a really kind of key political maneuver that refugee comics can make.
Perfect. Candida?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, it's really difficult to make these one-to-one sort of studies of what is the exact applied impact of a work of literature or art, because it's more diffuse than that. And I think especially with the ones we're looking at, they're quite recent. But if we go back and we look at something like Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis, which is really about the politics of the veil and liberal women living in Iran during the Iranian Revolution, it shows us, and I think in her preface, she talks about how her goal is to change Western ideas of Iranian women. So she shows us that her grandmother was a feminist in the 60s, because, of course, most people outside Iran think of Iranian women as oppressed and, they are forced to wear the veil and they accept it and so on. And I think that's a good example of a book that has changed a lot of kind of Western white feminist ideas about women who wear veils inside Iran and outside. But I can say that because that book's been around for decades now. A lot of these comics are much more recent. What I would like to add is that we wrote the epilogue to the book during the fall of 2023. And we weren't sure what we would write about in the epilogue. How do you bring all these different ideas together? We didn't just want to repeat what we'd said in the introduction. And Dom and I, in our different locations in the UK and Canada, of course, were glued to the news and social media as the war on Gaza began. And what we were seeing was actually comics being made by mostly people outside of Gaza, but by some people there, and being posted very quickly to Instagram, especially. Instagram is this interesting format where I think now you can have at least maybe up to 20 photos in your scroll in one post. So it almost works like a comics grid. So artists can make a comic that might be 4 panels, 8, 12, or whatever, and they can post it to one Instagram post, and we scroll through it. So what we write about in the epilogue is some of those artists, some in the US, some in Gaza, posting for the world to witness what is happening and to also speak about what they're experiencing firsthand. And I think comics like that have made a difference to people's perception because they're an alternative form of information. I think a lot of people understand now that comics aren't just fantasy or escapism. They can actually attest to reality and they can speak truths. So we're thinking there about the way comics might be able to reveal things that people aren't able to see through mainstream media. And I think that has had an effect.
Excellent. In chapter 2, you introduce the term, quote, refugeeness. Can you define that and its importance in the comics medium? And Candida?
Sure. I'm kind of smiling because we have so many terms that use refugee as the root, and then refugeeness, refugeetude, and so on, that, even doing the index, we couldn't believe how many different variations we have. And it starts to feel very academic and very scholarly. But critical refugee studies has been a really important discipline for us, and we're trying very much to bring comic studies into conversation with critical refugee studies, which itself is interdisciplinary. It includes scholars from literature, from sociology, political science, economics, and all kinds of disciplines. So I know that I know Dom too, we really immersed ourselves in that scholarship to try and figure out the state of that field and how what scholars are doing there, including people like Vinh Nguyen, who writes our forward, what terminology are they using that we might want to use? And for me, one of the really helpful concepts was refugeeness, which it's a complicated term, and I'm going to sound very sort of eggheady as I explain it, but it's a term that helps us understand the ambivalence that many refugee people themselves feel about the word refugee. And thinking about this term more recently, I've realized, and I wish I'd put this in the book, but it's a quite similar or parallel to the idea of double consciousness that, W.B. Du Bois and African American scholars have used. And Du Bois, writing at the beginning of the 20th century, says something like, a Black man in America consciously feels his two-ness, that he knows how he feels as a person, but also how the white world sees him. And refugeeness is a kind of parallel term. So it describes the way that people who are called refugees or migrants or asylum seekers, they know that that's the label they need to access aid, to get into a camp, to get the paperwork they might need to apply for asylum. They understand they have to fit that category, but they know they're much more than that. So it's this kind of double consciousness. They understand how the world sees them, but they also, in some ways, reject that idea because it's so one dimensional and so limited. So refugeeness is a term that I use to look at some of the comics where I can see in panels, say a woman in Don Brown's The Unwanted turning to the reader, breaking the fourth wall and saying, I never asked to be called a refugee. I never wanted this word. That's not who I am. And that in that simplicity speaks to the complexity of the idea of refugeeness.
Yeah.
People who have to take on the label. They're not going to reject it because they're pragmatic and they're political enough to know it matters. But it's also so limiting to who they are.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Dom, anything you wanted to add to that?
Just to say that refugeeness and this idea of a kind of double vision, if you like, or kind of seeing the world twice, is imitated in the comics form, right? Something I mentioned earlier. I think Hilary Chute actually uses the phrase double vision, and that we kind of see the world as it's meant to be, but then also as being kind of partly outside of that world. We sort of see how it's constructed as well.
Excellent. Okay, so I want to come back to you, Candida, for this question because I think you did chapter 2, which also foregrounds comics' ability to visualize the spatial characteristics of refugee camps. So I wanted to address that a little bit. Can you provide a couple of examples of comics that do this particularly well? And then what this technique accomplishes, not just for the reader, but also the refugee as well.
For sure. So, chapter 2 is about refugee camp comics, and I talk a little bit about Kate Evans and her work in Calais and Dunkirk camps. But mostly, I focus on Don Brown's The Unwanted, which is comics journalism about Syrians kind of in camps and on the move post 2015. And then Olivier Kugler's Escaping Wars and Waves, where he actually goes to some of the same camps that Don Brown depicts as well. So, there's a lot of overlap there. And one interesting thing is that one of the ways we're used to seeing refugees in mainstream media is from above. And Dom actually writes about the drone perspective in a chapter. But we often see these kind of aerial photos of tiny little boats on the Mediterranean packed with people in orange life vests. Or we see, if you even go to the UNHCR website, you can see like overhead photos at the camps. So you see this kind of sort of makeshift city in the middle of a desert, usually. And what Don Brown does is he uses those aerial views to show us the scale, but also the kind of desolation and remoteness, because so many refugee camps are really in the middle of the desert. And there are rows and rows, usually, of tents or barracks if they're more permanent. And one of the repeated visual images across a lot of refugee camps is the iconic blue UN camp. And so we get these rows and rows that it looks very orderly and organized from above. And of course, it's border. There will be some kind of fence or gate. And I talk about barbed wire in the book too, because that's a motif that comes up so much. Barbed wire separating people who are refugees from people who are citizens. But what Don Brown does is he then comes down to ground and he shows us people living their lives, people putting washing out on their line, kids drawing comics, people setting up businesses, because there's a strong emphasis in his comic on kind of entrepreneurship as a way to challenge the idea that refugees are always dependent. So we see people setting up small businesses in camps to, make a little bit of money. So I think what we see is these camp spaces are rich. They're full of life. They're full of people helping each other. And they are full of what I call refugee to refugee care, which so often we get the idea it's foreign aid workers who come in and they dispense charitable donations and they help people and then they leave. But what I think both Brown and Kugler and Kate Evans show is that refugees are capable, independent people themselves, and they will help each other. So they're not as dependent or as needy as that kind of dominant stereotype suggests. There's lots of interesting repeated imagery in terms of refugee camps. They're often seen, as I said, as being kind of like cities. So one of the tensions I see in, say, Olivier Kugler's comics is refugee camps are supposed to be temporary. They're supposed to be provisional. They're just keeping people for a little while until they can move on. But in fact, he draws these spaces as having become quite permanent because people aren't going to move on. And so they're making home, they're putting up maps of their homeland. They are, setting up little kitchens inside their tent because they want to make it home. They need to feel like they belong. So I think in the end, a lot of these cartoonists are in a way showing us that people living in refugee camps are just as domestic, just as banal, just as everyday as those of us living in warm beds in houses somewhere else. And they try not just to humanize, because that's kind of a sort of a dead end, to humanize someone and so what, but to show us that the line between refugee camps and the rest of the world is really porous, that people move in and out of them, and that they are like cities where many of the rest of us live.
You just heard from Candida Rifkin and Dominic Davies. Candida is a professor in the Department of English at the University of Winnipeg, and Dom is reader in English at City St. George's, University of London. They're co-authors of the book Graphic Refuge, Visuality and Mobility in Refugee Comics. This episode was brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week when we take a closer look at the field of comic studies, including its interdisciplinary nature, how it will continue to evolve, and how comics artists are responding to today's events. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.